Chapter 19. The First Visit. August 19th, 1976. To celebrate Ho Chi Minh's birthday, we didn't have to work, but instead gathered at the Assembly Hall. The VC called it a celebration of the three major holidays: Ho Chi Minh's birthday on August 19th, the Southern Resistance Day on August 23rd, and National Day on September 2nd. I wasn't eager to attend the assembly and listen to their speeches, but there was no way to avoid it. On the bright side, we didn't have to labor and even got some decent food, at least a little meat. The hall had been decorated with flags and banners for days in preparation. Since the unification of Vietnam, the three-color flag of the so-called Republic of South Vietnam had vanished, leaving only the blood-red flag of North Vietnam. Yet again, the people of the South had been deceived under the guise of patriotism, turning the entire nation into a communist state. I couldn't help but wonder, who was truly the puppet here? The decorations in the hall were the same as always, with Ho Chi Minh's portrait hung prominently on the back wall, near the podium where the cadres sat. Below it was a slogan: "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." This time, we sat on wooden benches instead of the ground. Since labor assignment began, detainees in Group 2 have been working in the assembly hall, weaving baskets, making brooms, and crafting bamboo products. Most of them were older and assigned lighter duties. Moreover, there wasn't enough land to accommodate nearly 2,000 detainees for labor. The detainees in Group 2 had gathered wood from old shelters of wartime refugees to construct benches for the hall. They buried 10-centimeter wooden planks into the ground to form bench legs and nailed crossbeams to create seats. Though these benches were far from comfortable, at least we didn't have to sit on the ground anymore. A fixed podium had also been built at the back of the hall, complete with a table and chairs for the cadres during meetings. The hall was crowded with cadres that morning. After the usual routine of standing and sitting multiple times to greet the camp management, Thuy, the chief warden, introduced a speaker, writer Ho Ai Tan, who would lecture on Ho Chi Minh's poetry. Thuy described Ho Ai Tan as a renowned Vietnamese writer, though none of us had ever heard of him. Ho Ai Tan was over 50, slightly overweight and short, with a square face and chubby cheeks. Unlike other senior cadres who typically wore untucked shirts, he tucked his in and even wore a tie. Another surprise was when a cadre brought him a bottle of beer instead of the usual glass of water. I don't remember much about Ho Ai Tan's lecture on Ho Chi Minh's poetry because it was so mediocre, akin to Vietnamese folk rhymes, or worse. His 6-8 verse poems, apart from the Chinese script collection Prison Diary, which we doubt Ho actually wrote, were unimpressive. What stood out to me was his audacious opening remark: "The reason Chairman Ho's poetry is great is simply because it is Chairman Ho's poetry." I couldn't fathom how he dared to make such a statement during a lecture to us. Mocking Ho Chi Minh was a grave offense in the VC-controlled nation. However, the cadres didn't seem to grasp the underlying sarcasm. When they saw us applauding, they clapped along. Around noon, after Ho Ai Tan left, Deputy Warden Bao delivered a brief speech about the three major holidays. In conclusion, he announced that, to demonstrate the party and state's leniency, families would be allowed to visit us on September 1st and 2nd. It had been 14 months since I entered the camp, and this was perhaps the most emotional moment I had experienced. After hearing the party and state's policy of 3 years in re-education camps, I had lost all trust. Initially, they told us to bring food and clothing for a month. Now, it was 3 years, with release dependent on progress. But what did progress mean? No one could define or explain it. I realized it meant they could keep us indefinitely or release us whenever they pleased. The path back to my family seemed completely blocked. Even if I were to return to society, my life would be devoid of hope. living in the re-education camp was akin to an existence without a soul. Day after day, I functioned like a shadow, working, eating, and sleeping at the sound of bell, like Pavlov's dog or machine. My thoughts no longer belonged to me. Sometimes, as I worked, I thought of my family, even in my dreams. They were my lifeline. Meeting them was an overwhelming motivation, not just for me, but for everyone else. Writing letters and enduring the 2-week wait was agonizing. I didn't know what to write to my family, knowing the letter would be meticulously censored by the cadres. They didn't want us dwelling on our families, insisting we focus on re-education and place absolute trust in the party and state's policies. It was absurd to ask us to feel at ease in prison and believe in their lies. Yet we had to repeat those lies like parrots. In the re-education camp, we were not only forced into labor, but also into certain ways of thinking. In my official letter to my family, I simply shared the details of the visit, date, time, and location, and inquired about my grandmother, mother, wife, son, and other relatives. Secretly, I wrote a private letter to my wife, hiding it in the handle of the basket I planned to bring out. Even though I knew it would likely be thoroughly searched, I wanted her to know that my return was far from certain. I urged her to move on with her life, as she was still young, but I couldn't bring myself to write those words explicitly. Instead, I encouraged her to adapt to the new society without me. I loved her deeply, but didn't want her to waste her life waiting. My only wish was to see my son, believing she could care for him even if she decided to leave me. I whispered to my wife about the letter hidden in the strap of her handbag, and she told me she had written me a letter, which she hid in the shrimp paste container. Hiding a letter in a sticky and smelly container, like that was certainly a clever idea. I saw my wife cry when I kissed her goodbye. The 15 minutes of visitation had passed. Everyone stood up reluctantly, as if trying to prolong the farewell moment. The guards urged the inmates to quickly line up and return to the camp, making room for the next group, perhaps the only way to bring the visitation time to an end. I carried the 2 gift bags slowly to join the line. My wife turned away to hide her tears. The excitement of waiting for this moment had now given way to the sadness of parting. As the inmates walked back into the camp, many kept turning their heads until they were past the camp gates, the gates that separated 2 prisons, the prison for inmates in the re-education camp and the prison for people in the socialist society. Due to the large number of visitors, inspections became more lax. There weren't enough guards, so they allowed some team leaders among the inmates to assist with the inspections. I laid out each item from the bags on the hall floor. The guard merely observed while an inmate from Block 1 checked my belongings by lifting and putting down each item without opening them. I worried about my wife's letter, but everything went smoothly. The letter my wife wrote was 10 pages long, written over the week leading up to her visit. She said she wouldn't have a time or opportunity to tell me everything she had experienced since leaving Chuvan in school to return to my family. Such stories were common across generations in Vietnamese families. Conflict between a husband's family and the wife were often central to family dramas. In Vietnam, 3 generations often lived under one roof, making such tensions nearly unavoidable, especially when the wife, a stranger to the family, lived alone with her in-laws. The old stories of domineering mothers-in-law and difficult sisters-in-law had persisted through the ages and would likely continue indefinitely. I had been aware of this dynamic since the first day we lived together and had tried to create our own home. But when my wife returned to live with my family, things reverted to how they were, or perhaps became even worse, because I was no longer there. The difficulty for my wife in this new society was that, as an employee of the old regime, she couldn't find any work. She had to share the family's poverty. Additionally, under a traditional Vietnamese custom, a woman was expected to live with her in-laws when her husband was absent. My wife had no choice but to follow this custom. Regarding my family situation, my wife didn't say anything explicit in her letter, only that she often had to queue for hours to buy rice and other household items. At least she managed to get some essentials. Our child had enough formula mixed with rice water, though my grandmother, who loved coffee with milk, had to give up her milk for the baby. In both the camp and the outside world, we had all learned to lie. We lied to each other, but we understood the truth behind the lies. The country was in ruins. The people were impoverished, but everyone was forced to say that the country was prosperous and difficulties were only temporary. Temporary for how long? Or was it permanent? Knowing my family situation, I didn't ask for anything. I didn't want to burden them further. While the packages from my family were a great help to me in the camp, they were a strain on them, as they had to sacrifice from their already meager resources. I couldn't comprehend how a country could require its people to queue for basic necessities. It was living proof of the saying, "Don't listen to what the communists say, but look carefully at what the communists do." That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were filled with my family and what I would write in reply to my wife's letter. What could I say besides offering her my love and reassurance? I wasn't even sure if my love would comfort her or deepen her despair. At just 25 years old, she had to suppress her desires, live alone to care for our child, and wait for a love that seemed distant and hopeless, a truly tragic situation. In her letter, my wife wrote that she was happy to have my love, something not everyone was fortunate to experience. She intended to wait for me for 3 years, as the party and the state had stipulated for re-education inmates. But what if it wasn't just 3 years? She didn't know what would become of her if we could only meet again when our hair was gray. How could I respond to my wife's letter when I didn't believe what the communists said? My life seemed to be over, but what about hers? I didn't want to be selfish, but what could I say? I still remembered the saying, losing the country to the communists means losing everything. Yet I knew my wife wouldn't leave me unless all hope was gone, or unless I was dead. Sometimes I thought about death as a way to free both of us from our suffering. I thought about many things, but could only write about my emotions when I saw her and our child. Seeing her hold our child, I knew she was happy because our child was her greatest joy. September 2nd, the Independence Day of the Communists, was uneventful. The camp was busy with the final visitation day instead of celebrations. I no longer expected any visitors and spent the day rereading my wife's letter and thinking about her and our child. Around noon, Deep was called out again to receive more gifts, and he told me there was a small package for me as well. My wife had sent some dry noodles and, more importantly, another letter hidden within. I carefully searched and found the letter nestled among the noodles. In her letter, she described her feelings when she saw me, trembling and sweating, as if she were ill. She said I looked like someone from hell, and she thought she might never see me again on her way home. Others joked that anyone who kissed their wife during visitation would be punished upon returning to the camp. They asked if I had been punished. She expressed her determination to overcome all hardships to wait for me. I love her deeply, but I didn't want to let her down. I didn't know how to convey this. On the other hand, she was living with hope and happiness from our child. I couldn't destroy her dreams. People say, to live is to hope. She was living, so I couldn't kill her hope. In my letter, I wrote that I would love her forever, even if she lived a life without me. I didn't want her to waste her life waiting for me. But deep down, I still longed to return to her one day. Although I didn't believe in the 3-year re-education period promised by the communists, I clung to the hope that it might be true. That night, while we talked, Several empty buses arrived at the camp and parked near the main gate. What was happening? Since the so-called victims of the old regime had arrived at our camp, we had been waiting for this moment, but we didn't expect it to happen so soon after visitation, with our belongings still unpacked. At 10 p.m., the camp officers called us to prepare for relocation. By midnight, after 1 year, 2 months, and 18 days, we left Long Tan Camp.